Jason Adkins, Executive Director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference. We're back again for another week of the Capital Update. We have a special guest with us, Leah Patton, Executive Director of the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition. The Joint Religious Legislative Coalition is a partnership of the Islamic Center of Minnesota, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, the Minnesota Council of Churches, and the Minnesota Catholic Conference. Now you might ask, why are we a part of this organization that's dedicated to interfaith advocacy for social justice and fighting poverty? Well, the simple answer is we want to build common ground for the common good in Minnesota. We want to show what it means to gather together and advocate for good public policy, even though we have differences on a lot of important theological questions. We can put those differences aside, and for the good of Minnesotans, especially Minnesotans who are most vulnerable, we can come together, identify policies that we agree upon, and then advocate for those. And Leah leads our efforts at the Capitol and represents those four organizations on a number of key policy questions, which I'll invite her to talk about in a second. But I think it's important for our viewers to know that for the church to work together across partisan lines and with different groups is really, really important. We know that only a small percentage of our legislators are actually Catholic. So how do we get things done? Well, sometimes we can get things done just as an individual organization and work to pass legislation and work to oppose it. But oftentimes we need to work with partnerships. And not only is it the right thing to do from a practical standpoint to gather a broad base of support for a piece of legislation, it's also necessary for legislators to see groups working together and solving problems and coming together as a broader community. So it's really, really important that we find partnerships across different issues, whether it's combating assisted suicide or promoting school choice or combating poverty. And we've had a lot of great initiatives and successes around that. But our principal point of engagement around anti-poverty advocacy issues from an interfaith standpoint is the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition. I've invited Leah to join the program today precisely because it was a really important day for the JRLC, bringing people together to advocate. So I want to turn it over to you to share a little bit about what happened today at the Capitol.
Awesome, thank you, Jason. So we had our first ever, I think, a day of prayer and advocacy. So essentially this event was focused around bringing in faith community leaders and clergy together to connect, remind ourselves of our commonly shared values, especially in a difficult time that we find ourselves in, and then actually use those values to then go to the Capitol and advocate for things that we all care about. So some of those issues are around poverty, some of them are around homelessness, gambling harm mitigation, things like that. But it was a really just lovely time to have people come and connect, and then have a prayer in front of the Capitol, and then send everybody off to go meet with their legislators. So
yeah, so a powerful way to bookend the program part of it was for clergy talking about what it means to do work at an interfaith or multi-faith level, and then our four faith traditions in the JRLC represented with a prayer on the Capitol. What were some of the issues that advocates today from the JRLC spoke to legislators about?
Yes, so we had three kind of primary issues with some basic talking points that we gave people and gave brief overviews of each of those issues. The first one that we talked about was based on payday lending. So last year, Exodus Lending, that JRLC has a partnership with, a longstanding partnership with, passed a 36% interest rate cap on short-term small dollar loans, known as payday loans. So this year, the continuation of that policy is to essentially make sure that interest rate applies to any bank lending to anyone in Minnesota. So this is kind of known as the rent-a-bank bill. States from out of state that either directly or through a third party lend to people in Minnesota that, because of federal laws, are allowed to apply their own state's interest rates on those loans. So the bill that we're working on this year would close that loophole and make sure that they have to adhere to Minnesota's laws when lending to Minnesotan citizens, which just makes sense. I mean, you should be able to trust that the laws your elected officials pass are the ones that apply to you. So that's the first issue that we had people advocate for. The second one is a partnership that we have, we've been supporting NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, who does a lot of phenomenal work. We chose to partner with NAMI this year because of the intersection that between homelessness and mental health issues. And that's something that we were continually reminded of people who provide those direct services in our communities, that was important and increasingly obvious in terms of need. So NAMI this year, they asked us to talk about funding for what is called voluntary engagement. So essentially, prior to 2020, if you as a family member or a friend were concerned about someone in your life exhibiting signs of mental illness, any psychotic breaks, delusions, anything like that, paranoia, you could call your county services and somebody would go out and talk to that person and basically say, are you willing to, take advantage of the resources, go get treatment? If that person said no, there was very little else that you could do to get that person assistance. The threshold for putting a mental health hold on someone is very high. Involuntary commitment, understandably, that threshold is very high. So that's kind of where that ended. In 2020, provisions were passed to allow for this voluntary engagement concept, which is allowing those mental health workers to engage with that person over a period of 90 days. The idea is that you would build a relationship with that individual, and hopefully because of that trust, that individual would be more willing to take advantage of whatever resources are available, whether that's treatment, social supports, housing supports, anything like that, that you can at least get them something because you have that trusting relationship there. So this year, we are supporting $250,000 worth of funding, which I believe is in both the Senate Health and Human Services Finance Bill and the House version of the bill as well. $250,000 for a pilot program that would be based in Otter Tail County. Essentially, Minnesota Management and Budget would circle back, see what the impacts of that program are, and see if it's viable statewide. We also promoted the funding level that was in the House more generally for those type of services, which I believe was at $1.5 million. So it was kind of a both-and approach to that one. The third issue that we had advocates lobby for with their legislators today was around the gambling expansion bill. And now this is something that the Catholic Conference has worked very closely and very hard with us on the last few years to make sure that people who do deal with addictions, that's a very real and heartbreaking part of their lives, are not overlooked when we go, when we're talking about such a sweeping expansion. So we are primarily concerned about making sure that families and people suffering addiction have resources available to them, that the state invests in that in a meaningful way, that young people who are particularly prone to online sports betting, this kind of type of app-based betting, that they are protected as much as possible in terms of prohibiting advertising to them, making sure that we're buffering that because of how prone young people are to developing problematic gambling behaviors with that form of betting in particular. And then also making sure that the way that the apps function have different warning signs in them saying, gambling is dangerous. These are the stats in terms of wagering and actually, what you win, things like that. Like what you would see on a cigarette packet, basically. I wouldn't know. But something like that. Then we also have things of prohibiting push notifications through applications to hook people back in. There's also things like setting a voluntary limit when you sign up for a betting website of, okay, I'm only going to allow myself X amount of dollars before I'm put in like a cooling off period, essentially, before you can re-engage with that. So there's a lot of different approaches we can take. We don't support the gambling bill. Our approach is essentially we still want to be at the table to talk about those who are really vulnerable to its impacts, and that's what we're trying to do.
Not driving people further into poverty.
Exactly.
Not being exploited by payday loans, getting the mental health resources that they need, and then being protected from a predatory online gaming industry that could really have a real negative effect on families, individuals, and on the broader community.
100%.
So when we talk about the preferential option for the poor in Catholic social teaching, the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition is one way we engage at an interfaith level to buttress our anti-poverty advocates and do it in a way that's collaborative with other faith communities. Leah, you've been a lobbyist before you joined JRLC, but you've also been a legislative assistant as well. Share just briefly your thoughts on why citizen advocacy is important and why you think it makes a difference.
Oh, I mean, it makes all the difference. It is the difference, right? So I like to joke that I'm kind of a mercenary, right? I get paid to do this. we can get into certain offices. If you are a constituent, if you are somebody's voter, that door is open to you so much more quickly, and you are taken so much, your input is gold to legislators, essentially. So it is imperative that people of faith are showing up at those committee hearings. They're talking to their legislators. They are sending emails when something comes up they're concerned about. They're calling offices and asking questions. It's essential that legislators hear from people of faith about what we are concerned about, because our faith communities oftentimes are providing direct services to the communities that are most in need. So you know what is going on. You know what you see day to day in your congregation, in the homeless shelter that you're volunteering with, food shelves, any kind of community work. People of faith see that and they understand the level of need. So legislators need to hear from those people that are actually engaging in that work on a practical level.
So if people are inclined to and excited about doing work, advocacy work at an interfaith and multi-faith level, you can be sure that the JRLC has excellent resources for you in that regard. The JRLC legislative agenda, as being part of our sponsoring organization, it has the imprimatur of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, so you can trust that we have signed off on that agenda, and that's something that you can work on. Leah, where do people go to find out more about JRLC and its advocacy work?
I'm glad you asked, Jason. It's www.jrlc.org, and you can also email info@jrlc.org for additional questions.
Wonderful. Leah, thanks for joining us on this Capital Update. Really encourage folks to check out JRLC and the good work that they're doing and all the important anti-poverty advocacy that's going on there. There's a big success that